Why are you just holding her? Hit her harder. Just not on the face, so it doesn't leave marks. In a couple of minutes, she'll tell us exactly where she hid the money herself. My mother-in-law hissed at my husband, standing over me in the dimly lit living room of her own luxury condo. And in that whisper, directed at her adult, married son, there was so much icy, practiced calm that I, lying on the hardwood floor with my cheekbone throbbing from the impact, suddenly caught myself forming a strange, almost academic thought. I wondered how many times in her life this woman had already given similar orders, that her voice didn't tremble on a single syllable. I remained silent, tasting blood on my lip and feeling the heavy, looming breath of my husband above me. He had frozen with his hand raised, as if he himself was terrified of what he was ready to do at his mother's first command. Meanwhile, somewhere in the pocket of my jacket, tossed by the entryway of this apartment, a geolocation report was being transmitted silently, without a single beep, to a secure server. The audio track of the last few minutes and a short SOS message had just reached 3 people, each of whom was right now setting in motion something that my mother-in-law, standing over me with the triumphant face of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey after a years-long chase, could not even begin to imagine. In a few minutes, her life, my husband's life, and that very family prosperity for which she was ready to do anything, including having her daughter-in-law beaten by her own son's hands, would collapse so swiftly and irreversibly that she wouldn't even have time to understand at what exact moment she lost control of the situation she considered completely calculated in advance. My name is Delphine. If, 4 years ago, someone had told me that I would be lying on the floor of someone else's apartment, listening to a woman I had once tried to genuinely love as family demand that her own son cause me physical pain to extract, a confession for a crime I didn't commit, I probably wouldn't have believed a single word. I would have considered such a scenario something out of a cheap pulp thriller, not my own life, which was arranged, as it seemed to me then, intelligently, predictably, and securely. But life, as I had managed to realize long before this evening, has a surprising ability to lead us to the exact conclusions that seem unthinkable right up until the moment they happen to us, leaving behind only one honest question. Was I ready for this? And if so, from what exact moment? I'll start from afar. Because, to understand how I ended up on the floor of someone else's living room, listening to a demand to hit me harder, you first need to understand what kind of person I was long before I even knew my future mother-in-law's name, and why what happened that evening became not an end, but a logical, albeit painful, continuation of a path I had chosen for myself much earlier than anyone in my new family could have suspected. I grew up in a family in the American Midwest where decisions were made deliberately, not impulsively. My father, who managed a large automotive parts manufacturing plant for nearly his entire working life, taught me one simple rule that I remembered for the rest of my life, and which subsequently saved me more than once from reckless actions. Before acting, you need to understand the whole picture, not react to the first emotion, no matter how strong it seems in the moment. Decisions made in a state of passion almost always cost more than decisions made in the quiet of one's own head, where no one is rushing or pressuring you. My mother, who worked as a corporate financial analyst in the same industry, added her own, much more applied vision to this. Any problem, no matter how tangled it looks at first glance, can and should be broken down into its components, separating facts from emotions and causes from consequences. It is precisely in this separation that a truly sober decision is born, one that you don't have to shamefully revise later. These two principles, absorbed by me in those years when I hadn't even thought about how they would come in handy in my adult life, formed the basis of my own character. They shaped a person who knows how to keep a poker face in any situation, someone who would rather stay silent and ponder the next step than throw a tantrum that resolves nothing. I did well in school, got my degree in forensic accounting, and after graduation, I landed a job in the internal audit department of a massive Fortune 500 conglomerate in Chicago. Step by step, gaining experience, I rose to the position of lead internal auditor. It was a job that many of my peers considered boring and paper-pushing, but for me, it became a true calling. Because precisely in the numbers, in the financial disclosures, in the barely noticeable discrepancies between what is declared and what is actually happening, I learned to see much more truth about people than in their words, spoken aloud with the most sincere facial expressions. My personal life developed slowly, and without much rush. There were relationships that ended in nothing. There were men who seemed suitable exactly up until the moment it became clear that behind their beautiful words about the future, there was nothing but a habit of speaking beautifully. Having seen enough similar stories among my own friends, I decided for myself one day that it was better to remain alone than to spend years next to a person whose words diverged from their deeds so much that talking to them became a pointless exercise. I met my future husband, Callum, at an industry compliance symposium downtown, where I was sent by my company as an expert in internal controls. He was there as a representative of a 501c3 family philanthropic foundation, which, according to official materials, was engaged in supporting small businesses and social initiatives in our region. Callum carried himself modestly, asked substantive questions, and didn't try, unlike many other participants at such events, to impress people with loud phrases about his own achievements. This manner of his, calm and slightly shy, seemed to me then a rare and pleasant exception to the general rule that men occupying even a slightly prominent position usually tend to overestimate themselves. We got to talking after the conference, exchanged contacts, and after a few months of communication, which started with business emails and gradually transitioned into something much more personal, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I had met someone around whom I didn't have to pretend to be someone else to be liked. And it was exactly this illusion of the absolute naturalness of our relationship that later played a cruel joke on me, because I, accustomed to trusting my own analytical intuition in professional matters, turned out to be much less attentive to details in personal matters than I should have been. Even before I met Cordelia, his mother, one of my colleagues who accidentally learned the last name of the family my new boyfriend belonged to, pulled me aside during a lunch break. Lowering her voice, she said that a few years ago she had heard highly ambiguous reviews about the foundation his mother ran from acquaintances in the nonprofit sector. The reviews concerned not so much direct violations as a general atmosphere of opacity around the distribution of funds and a strange turnover rate among the CPAs who had worked there previously. At the time, I treated this warning with a fair share of skepticism, explaining what I heard as ordinary professional gossip, typical of the rather tight-knit circle of people employed in the charity sphere, where personal grievances often take the form of serious-sounding accusations. However, the very fact that such a warning sounded even before I personally managed to encounter a single alarming signal subsequently surfaced in my memory more than once. It made me wonder how much earlier I could have discerned my future mother-in-law's true face if I had allowed myself to treat other people's words with the same professional attentiveness with which I was accustomed to. Treating numbers in SEC filings. The first meeting with Callum's mother, Cordelia, took place about 6 months after our relationship began, and it went, at first glance, quite well. The hostess welcomed me to her sprawling North Shore estate, asked about my work with genuine, as it seemed to me then, interest, treated me to an upscale catered-style dinner, and behaved with that degree of cordiality usually characteristic of people genuinely glad for the appearance of a new person in their child's life. However, even then, if I had allowed myself to listen to my own professional habit of noticing discrepancies between words and behavior, I might have paid attention to a few details that subsequently seemed to me much more significant than they did that evening. For example, the piercing, evaluative gaze with which Cordelia questioned me not so much about my personal qualities or interests, but about what exactly the internal audit department does, which companies I had audited before, and how deeply I have to delve into the financial reporting of organizations that become the object of my professional scrutiny. Questions that I then considered ordinary maternal curiosity, but which later looked completely different. It was as if this woman was trying from the very beginning to understand how dangerous a person with my qualifications, ending up in close proximity to her son, could be to her own affairs. It is worth mentioning another detail that escaped my attention that evening, but later turned out to be one of the most important threads of the whole story. My husband, telling his mother about where I work and what exactly I do, pronounced the word auditor with some deliberate carelessness, as if trying in advance to downplay the significance of my position. Cordelia, upon hearing this word, froze for a split second with her silverware in her hands, and only a moment later returned her face to its previous welcoming expression. It was a moment so short and so easily explained by ordinary thoughtfulness that it could only be noticed with that specific attention to micro-expressions that is developed by years of working with people prone to hiding their true motives behind well-chosen words. Even then, Although I didn't fully realize it, a vague feeling was born in me that before me was not just a caring mother of an adult son, concerned about his personal happiness, but a person accustomed to carefully controlling every detail of the surrounding reality, including the impression she makes on people capable, with due interest, of seeing something less noble behind the facade of philanthropic activity. Talks about a wedding started shortly after this first meeting. And here, for the first time, another character trait of my future mother-in-law manifested itself, which I initially mistook for ordinary parental care. She insisted on taking over the organization of the celebration, explaining it by her desire to make the party truly memorable. However, upon closer inspection, her persistence turned out to be a desire to control literally every detail, from the guest list to the wording on the invitations. Moreover, she met any of my own wishes with a polite but absolutely inflexible smile of a person for whom someone else's opinion exists only as a formality subject to polite listening, but by no means to consideration, in the final decision. In these disputes, Callum invariably took the position of an outside observer, preferring to agree with his mother on any controversial issue, just to avoid conflict. And I, observing this behavioral model even before the marriage, convinced myself then that such compliance was a temporary phenomenon associated exclusively with pre-wedding jitters, and not a stable character trait of the man I was going to marry. We had a modest wedding, without the excessive pomp that neither I nor Callum had ever particularly dreamed of. And the first year of our life together went surprisingly smoothly. We settled in my townhouse in Lincoln Park, which I had inherited long before meeting my husband. Work for both of us went on as usual. And Cordelia's visits, although they happened regularly, initially did not go beyond the bounds of decency, limited to Sunday brunches and rare remarks about the household, characteristic, as it seemed to me then, of almost any mother-in-law, regardless of her character. Gradually, however, these remarks began to take on a more and more specific direction, shifting from questions about how I cook or clean toward a much more targeted interest in my profession. Cordelia constantly brought up conversations about how complicated the internal control system is in large corporations, and how easy, or, conversely, difficult it is for an outsider to discover financial violations if they are carefully disguised as legal transactions. And I, answering these questions with professional directness, didn't yet wonder why an elderly woman managing a charitable foundation would have such a close interest in the intricacies of corporate audits. The key turning point that determined the entire subsequent development of events was a proposal I received at work about a year after the wedding. The conglomerate's leadership, having learned about my family ties with the board of trustees of the regional charitable foundation that my mother-in-law essentially managed, approached me with a delicate but extremely serious request. Unofficial, as part of the planned rotation of specialists between adjacent structures, they asked me to join the internal committee overseeing the financial reporting of this very foundation. For several months, the holding company's corporate security division had been accumulating signals about possible irregularities in the distribution of charitable funds. A direct audit by external third parties risked spooking those who might be involved in these violations, whereas my presence inside the family looked absolutely natural to outside eyes and would not arouse suspicion. I didn't agree immediately, perfectly understanding what an ambiguous position I was putting myself in, essentially agreeing to audit the activities of a structure managed by my own husband's mother. But two circumstances eventually swayed me toward this decision. First, the professional ethics I had absorbed at the beginning of my career required me to act in such situations exactly as any conscientious specialist would act, regardless of personal ties. And second, somewhere deep in my analytical consciousness, accustomed to comparing facts, my own, still vague suspicion was already beginning to form. My mother-in-law's strange interest in my profession and her unexpected persistence in matters concerning family property might be connected much more closely than it seemed at first glance. The first months of my covert work inside the foundation's financial documentation revealed nothing outright illegal. The reporting looked formally flawless. Payments went through official corporate accounts, and the recipients of charitable aid existed in reality and actually received at least some support, which at first glance completely removed all suspicions of the corporate security service. However, the deeper I delved into the structure of the movement of funds, the more clearly I began to notice the same repeating pattern. A significant part of the large donations coming from several regular corporate donors passed through the foundation in transit, then settled in the accounts of several formally independent but practically connected nonprofit organizations. Digging through public records in my free time, I discovered that the founders of these LLCs and NGOs were people connected by blood to my mother-in-law through her maiden name, the existence of which I had never even suspected before. One of the decisive confirmations of my suspicions was a case when, as part of my official work in the conglomerate, I happened to personally meet the director of a small local organization listed in the foundation's reports as the recipient of a massive grant for a program supporting large families. This woman, learning that I represented the side interested in the real use of the allocated funds, admitted with obvious relief that the amount her organization actually received was several times less than what was officially declared by the foundation as paid. She added that to all her cautious attempts to clarify the fate of the missing difference, the foundation's staff invariably replied with references to some temporary administrative overhead, promising to pay the rest later, which never happened. This conversation, recorded by me in compliance with all necessary procedural formalities and subsequently handed over to the investigation, became the first truly weighty first-hand evidence confirming my own analytical conclusions based solely on documentation. Returning home that evening, I felt for the first time in a long while that the need to see this matter through to the end outweighed any doubts about what price I would have to pay inside my own family for such principled behavior. It was during this period that my husband began to act strangely, increasingly staying late at meetings with his mother without clear explanations. Upon returning home, he became unusually irritable and prone to sharp, unmotivated mood swings, as if he, like a sponge, absorbed the anxiety and tension that reigned in his mother's house, and then brought them into our own home, just as one brings home someone else's cold. Once, returning from Cordelia's later than usual, he suddenly brought up a conversation about how it would be a good idea to put part of our shared property into a trust or prenuptial structure just in case, so that in the event of any unforeseen circumstances, he would have solid property guarantees. This conversation sounded so unnatural and so clearly not in his own manner of articulating thoughts that I, looking at him with a careful, studying gaze, asked a direct question. Did he come up with this himself, or did his mother give him the hint? By the way, he became flustered, averting his eyes and getting tangled in explanations about financial prudence. I became completely convinced that over the years of living next to a domineering mother, this man had never learned to make his own decisions in matters concerning money and property. During this period, I was helped by perhaps only one pillar of support, whose existence neither my husband nor my mother-in-law suspected. My old college roommate, Kerrigan, who by that time had risen to the position of an investigator in the state attorney's office, specializing precisely in white-collar crimes. I had shared my preliminary observations with her long before the situation became official, after studying the first alarming patterns in the Foundation's reporting. Kerrigan, having listened to me attentively, and without the slightest shadow of doubt in my sanity, advised me to act with extreme caution, to document literally every file to which I had access, and under no circumstances to inform anyone from my husband's family of my suspicions. Premature disclosure could not only destroy the entire evidentiary base, but also jeopardize my own safety if the people behind the scheme realized they were being watched from inside their own family. It was Kerrigan who, after a few more months of my independent, extremely cautious work with the documents, helped me make official contact with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division alongside my corporate security, explaining that the materials I had collected were already sufficient to initiate a full-fledged authorized investigation, rather than remaining in the status of the private curiosity of an alarmed daughter-in-law. My meetings with her always took place far from our usual spots where mutual acquaintances might see us. Most often in inconspicuous coffee shops on the other side of the city, Wicker Park or Logan Square, where I traveled via convoluted routes, explaining such absences to my husband either as unscheduled meetings or get-togethers with college friends, about whose existence he had not the slightest reason to ask for details. Kerrigan, possessing years of experience working precisely with family criminal schemes, where formal family ties are used as a reliable cover for illegal activities, repeatedly told me the same thought, which I later adopted as a kind of professional motto. The most dangerous thing in such investigations is not the criminal scheme itself, no matter how sophisticated it seems at first glance, but the emotional fatigue of the person leading the investigation from within the family. because it is precisely fatigue and gradual habituation to constant stress that push people into unforgivable mistakes at the most inopportune moments. Whereas a cold, methodical sequence of actions almost always allows one to bring the matter to an end without exposing oneself to unnecessary risk. Meanwhile, my parallel professional activity, hidden from my husband's family, began to bear much more serious fruit. Comparing the data on the movement of funds through affiliated nonprofit organizations with the real volumes of aid they provided, I discovered a gap calculated in amounts that could not be explained by ordinary administrative inefficiency or bureaucratic costs. It was a gap that pointed to the systematic siphoning of cash from large corporate donors into the private interests of a narrow circle of individuals, carefully disguised as charity. Judging by the totality of circumstantial evidence, the key role was played precisely by my mother-in-law, who used her reputation as a distinguished public figure as a reliable cover for a scheme she had clearly been building for years. Understanding the full seriousness of the collected materials, I handed over a preliminary report to my direct supervisor in corporate security, after which professional federal investigators specializing in economic crimes joined the case. My own role in this story transformed from that of an internal auditor fulfilling an official assignment into the role of a person voluntarily and consciously agreeing to see the initiated investigation through to the end, regardless of what price I personally would have to pay within my own family. Of course, neither Callum, nor, especially, his mother suspected what was really happening, continuing to consider me just a daughter-in-law spending too much time at the computer in the evenings under the pretext of a heavy workload. In reality, I, observing the strictest conspiracy, regularly met with the investigative handler, handed over collected documents, and gradually, step by step, helped build the evidentiary base that was ultimately supposed to lead to the complete exposure of the scheme, along with all its participants. In fairness, it's worth saying that not everything in my husband's behavior during that period fit into the simple scheme of spineless submission to his mother's will. Once late at night, when Cordelia called him yet again demanding to find out certain details of my workload, Callum, contrary to his usual habit, suddenly answered his mother sharply, asking her to stop interfering in our family affairs. Hanging up the phone, he turned to me with an expression of such confusion and inner pain that for a moment I almost believed in the possibility of his genuine liberation from years of dependence. He admitted then that at times he himself doesn't understand where his own thoughts end, and the thoughts instilled by his mother throughout his life begin, and that this feeling frightens him much more than any family scandals because it means the loss of control not only over relationships but over his own personality. I listened to this confession with sincere sympathy, realizing that before me was not a hardened villain, but a person mutilated by years of psychological pressure long before we met. However, the professional part of my mind, accustomed to evaluating facts rather than intentions, realized that such rare moments of clarity, despite all their sincerity, changed nothing in practical terms. The moment his mother showed sufficient persistence, Callum invariably returned to his former behavioral model, like a spring momentarily released and immediately compressed again by someone else's stronger will. Nevertheless, the atmosphere in the family continued to heat up, independently of my hidden activities. Cordelia, apparently sensing that some vague suspicions were gathering around the foundation, began to show increasingly nervous persistence in conversations about money. One day, she directly stated to me that she had allegedly discovered the disappearance of a large sum of cash intended for one of the charitable projects. She claimed that since I had recently been taking too much interest in the foundation's financial matters, she had very specific suspicions regarding where this money might have disappeared. I took this accusation with cold, professionally honed calmness, perfectly understanding that I was speaking right now not with a worried relative, but with a person who was either truly losing control of her own scheme and frantically looking for a scapegoat, or intentionally trying to create a false trail capable of distracting attention from the real movement of funds, while simultaneously discrediting me as the only person in the family possessing sufficient qualifications to figure out the true state of affairs. I firmly and without a single emotion in my voice answered Cordelia that I had not the slightest relation to the disappearance of any foundation funds, and that if she really had reason to believe a theft had occurred, it would be most reasonable to file an official police report rather than making baseless accusations within the family circle. This answer, delivered by me with absolute external equanimity, clearly did not please my mother-in-law. Judging by her suddenly changed facial expression, She expected from me rather excuses or confusion than a calm, legally calibrated counter-proposal. From this moment, as I understood much later, reconstructing the chronology of events with the help of investigators, Cordelia began to seriously consider me not just an inconvenient daughter-in-law who knew too much about the Foundation's financial affairs, but a real threat to the entire scheme she had built over the years, someone capable, possessing professional knowledge and access to documents, of gathering enough evidence for her complete exposure at any moment. To understand Cordelia's true motives, I had to reconstruct the history of her own life much later, together with Kerrigan, hidden from prying eyes almost as carefully as the Foundation scheme. It turned out that long before her marriage and Callum's birth, she herself had survived the collapse of a small family business managed by her first husband. This enterprise went bankrupt, not so much for objective economic reasons as because of an unscrupulous partner who managed to siphon off a significant part of the working capital through a chain of shell organizations, remaining completely unpunished due to the then-young Cordelia's lack of financial education and resources to take the case to court. This old, carefully concealed experience, apparently, formed in her that specific, almost manic conviction that money can be preserved in only one way: by removing it from any external control so deeply that no outside specialist, regardless of their qualifications, could subsequently get to the truth. And the charitable foundation, created by her many years later, became not so much an instrument of helping people as a kind of fortress built around her own carefully guarded capital. Understanding this backstory did not evoke a drop of sympathy in me for my mother-in-law, because no matter how bitter the lessons of her own youth were, they did not give her the slightest moral right to build a criminal scheme on other people's donations, and even less did they justify her readiness to cause physical harm to her daughter-in-law to preserve her loot. However, this information proved extremely useful from a purely practical point of view, as it explained the logic of building the scheme much more accurately than any assumptions based solely on the analysis of document flow. It allowed Kerrigan and the feds to determine much faster the circle of people most likely involved in the withdrawal of funds for personal rather than charitable needs. It was this realization, apparently, that pushed Cordelia toward a decision that a few months ago would have seemed unthinkable, even to herself. If the daughter-in-law could neither be bought nor intimidated by ordinary methods of family pressure, the only option left was either to find a way to discredit her in the eyes of her husband and the people around them, presenting her as a thief of non-existent money, or, if the first option didn't work, to resort to much more radical, frankly criminal methods of obtaining a confession the existence of which I did not yet suspect, continuing methodically, step by step, to bring closer the moment when the materials I had collected would be sufficient to hand the case over to a grand jury. One of the most indicative episodes of that period was a family dinner hosted by Cordelia on the occasion of another anniversary of her foundation's founding. Invited were not only relatives but also several major corporate donors, whose names, as I had already managed to find out by that time, appeared in the chain of suspicious transactions. It was at this dinner that my mother-in-law, taking advantage of the presence of outsiders, made her first public attempt to put me in a bad light, remarking aloud, as if jokingly, that modern daughters-in-law spend too much time digging through other people's documents instead of taking care of their home and family, and that she, admittedly, was becoming anxious about such excessive business acumen in a person who was supposed to simply be a good wife to her son. The guests at the table laughed restrainedly, taking the remark as a harmless jab typical of many mothers-in-law. However, meeting Cordelia's gaze at that moment, I saw in her eyes something much more serious than an older woman's usual jealousy of her daughter-in-law. It was a direct, almost challenging signal of a person who had already realized that I posed a real danger to her, and who, nevertheless, was not yet ready to admit it openly, preferring to act through half-hints and public barbs designed to throw me off balance in front of people whose trust was vital for her to maintain at any cost. I replied then with the same calm, slightly ironic intonation, noting that a good wife, in my opinion, is first and foremost an honest person. And honesty sometimes really requires attention to documents, and not just to domestic coziness. It was an answer that caused nods of approval from some guests, but which, judging by my mother-in-law's instantly chilled facial expression, finally convinced her that reaching an amicable agreement with me without an open confrontation would no longer be possible. From that evening, the tone of her address to me changed almost imperceptibly to outsiders, but absolutely obviously to myself. The politeness remained, but behind it, the cold, calculating hostility of a person preparing for a serious fight, rather than family reconciliation, emerged more and more clearly. About a month after that dinner, an episode occurred that I later called to myself a dress rehearsal for the final climax. Returning home earlier than usual, I caught my husband engaged in a strange activity. Carefully, trying not to leave any traces of a mess, he was looking through the contents of my Kate Spade work tote left at the entrance, clearly fulfilling someone's direct request rather than following his own curiosity. Because he was exclusively interested in the contents of one specific manila folder with printouts, which by a stroke of luck, I had taken to work the night before, instead of leaving at home as usual. Noticing me in the doorway, Callum flinched so openly that his attempt to explain his behavior as a search for forgotten keys looked almost comically unconvincing. Looking at him with a long, studying gaze, I asked only one question. "Did your mother ask you to check what I bring from work?" A question to which, instead of an honest answer, he burst into a confused tirade about how he worries about me, that I've been working too much lately, that his mother just wants there to be no secrets in the family. A tirade, every word of which only confirmed what I already knew. This man had no will or opinion of his own in matters concerning his mother. He didn't have one and apparently never would. I didn't make a scene, clearly understanding that any open confrontation at this moment would play exclusively into my mother-in-law's hands, giving her a formal reason to accuse me of being dramatic and emotionally unstable in front of mutual acquaintances. Instead, maintaining an outward calm, I informed my husband that from now on I would keep all working materials exclusively at the office, not at home, and that such searches, whoever initiated them, were a gross violation of personal boundaries, which I did not intend to tolerate in silence anymore. From that day on, I set up a separate, highly secure digital archive to which only Kerrigan and I had access, and I stopped bringing physical copies of the most sensitive documents home altogether, foreseeing that attempts to gain access to my materials would be repeated and, most likely, over time would become significantly more persistent and much less delicate than a banal search of a bag in my absence. The autumn of that year turned out to be particularly tense. In parallel with the final stage of collecting evidence through the foundation line, a real disinformation campaign began to unfold in my own family, organized, by all appearances, personally, by Cordelia. She began calling mutual acquaintances, hinting at some financial violations on my part, spreading a version among relatives that the daughter-in-law had allegedly embezzled a large sum of cash from the foundation and was now avoiding an honest conversation in every possible way. And to Callum, judging by his increasingly alienated and suspicious behavior towards me, day after day, she instilled the idea of my dishonesty with the same persuasiveness and persistence with which for years she had trained him to rely on her own opinion in everything instead of his. I watched as my husband, who until recently had seemed to me a soft but in his own way decent man, gradually turned into a conduit of someone else's will, ready to believe the most absurd accusation against his own wife, if this accusation came from his mother's lips. I realized that the resolution of this confrontation was approaching much faster than I had anticipated while preparing the evidence base for a grand jury subpoena. The climax of this disinformation campaign was an incident when Cordelia, not satisfied with rumors spread among relatives, appealed directly to the HR and corporate security department of my own holding company with an anonymous, as she probably thought, complaint. It alleged that the lead internal auditor, that is, me, had undisclosed family ties with the management of an external charitable foundation and therefore could not be considered an objective employee. The complaint, compiled so clumsily and with such obvious traces of personal animosity, merely resulted in my own management, who were perfectly aware of the real essence of my work within an operation, coordinated with federal investigators, passing this tip directly to my investigative handler as additional, circumstantial confirmation of the growing panic on the part of the suspects. Upon learning about this episode from my direct boss, who called me in for a short but extremely eloquent conversation, I experienced not fear or indignation, but rather the cold professional satisfaction of a person watching an opponent, who had previously acted carefully and calculatingly, begin to make their first noticeable mistakes, dictated by mounting panic. The appeal to corporate security meant that Cordelia no longer just suspected me of excessive curiosity, but seriously feared that the matter had gone much further than she would like, and that the usual methods of family pressure had ceased to bring the desired result. At the same time, attempts to apply pressure through mutual acquaintances became more frequent. Several people with whom I had maintained friendly relations even before marriage suddenly began asking me about affairs in the family, with exaggerated caution, clearly broadcasting questions formulated in advance by someone else. And one of the foundation's business partners, bumping into me accidentally at a professional event, allowed himself a half-joking remark that, according to rumors, a serious property dispute was brewing in our family. A remark which, being uttered aloud by an outsider, only confirmed the scale of the discrediting campaign my mother-in-law had launched against me long before I managed to officially press a single charge. It was during this period, sensing that the tension within the family had reached a point where any careless action could provoke an open conflict, that for the first time in a long while I went to visit my parents without Callum, using the pretext of a regular weekend visit. In reality, I desperately needed to hear my father's voice saying the same calm, balanced words with which he had guided me in childhood. My father, having carefully listened to my story shortened and scrubbed of all details related to the federal investigation, but quite frank regarding the description of the growing pressure from my mother-in-law and my husband's confusion, said a phrase then that I remembered for the rest of my life. If you see that a person who has power over a situation begins to get nervous and lose their usual restraint, it means you have already found their weak spot, and the only thing left for you to do is not retreat exactly when the pressure becomes especially strong. Because it is precisely at this moment that the opponent usually makes a fatal mistake. My mother, in turn, much more practical in matters of personal safety, insisted that I install a special panic button app on my phone, allowing me with one prearranged gesture to send a distress signal, along with my geolocation, immediately to several trusted contacts. She explained this not so much by specific fears for my life, but by a general rule learned during her years of working in the financial sector. If you are building a case against people capable of losing everything in the event of exposure, it is reasonable to prepare in advance for the fact that they may behave not entirely rationally when they feel they have nothing left to lose. I installed this app that same evening, perceiving it then more as a reasonable precaution than a vital tool. At the same time, I started a habit that seemed almost paranoid to me at first, but subsequently played a decisive role in the development of the whole story. Before every visit to my mother-in-law's condo, especially if a serious conversation was expected, I discreetly activated the voice memo recording on my Apple Watch. I explained this measure to myself by the need to have objective confirmation of any agreements or accusations that might be voiced in such conversations, and not at all by a premonition that one day this recording would become key evidence in a criminal case. The turning point was the day Kerrigan called me and reported that the materials accumulated over the past months had been deemed sufficient for federal action, and a judge, at the request of the prosecution, had already issued an order to freeze the accounts of the nonprofit organizations associated with the foundation. This included the personal assets that Cordelia had been siphoning out of charitable circulation into her own disposal for many years. A few days before the fateful evening, another episode occurred, the significance of which I fully realized only later. Cordelia unexpectedly called me personally, which in itself was a rarity, since she preferred to conduct all negotiations of recent months exclusively through her son. She said, in that soft, insinuating tone with which she had once greeted me at our very first meeting, that she would finally like to dot all the I's. She admitted that too much misunderstanding had accumulated between us and proposed we meet at her place in a calm atmosphere, without witnesses, to speak frankly, as two adult women genuinely caring for the same man. I agreed, perfectly understanding that such sudden peacefulness after months of growing hostility looked extremely suspicious. However, paradoxically, it was this suspicion that pushed me to accept the invitation. Intuition, honed by years of analyzing other people's financial schemes, suggested that a person suddenly offering peace, exactly when they are objectively losing, usually prepares not reconciliation, but a last, desperate attempt to turn the tide by any available means. And to miss the opportunity to see this attempt with my own eyes would mean giving up the chance to conclude the investigation much earlier than the original plan of the authorities assumed. Of course, before giving consent to this meeting, I immediately contacted Kerrigan, outlining the essence of the call and my intention to go anyway. My friend's reaction was much more guarded than I expected. She reminded me that the asset freeze was supposed to officially take effect literally any day now. which meant that anyone behind the scheme who felt the ground slipping from under their feet could behave much less predictably during this period than before, and that perhaps it would be wiser for me to postpone the visit at least until the court order was executed. Nevertheless, having weighed all the arguments for and against with the same methodism with which I was used to evaluating any complex situation, I decided not to back down. I explained to Kerrigan that canceling the meeting at the last minute would most likely only alarm Cordelia even more and push her to try to hastily destroy the remaining evidence. Whereas my presence, on the contrary, would create the illusion that the investigation was not yet ready for a climax, thereby winning the FBI precious time. Kerrigan, having listened to my arguments, ultimately agreed with their reasonableness but insisted on additional precautions. She personally checked the settings of my emergency alert app, made sure that the signal would go not only to her colleagues, but directly to the dispatch of the nearest Chicago PD precinct, and also gave me a phone number that, according to her, should be dialed immediately if the situation began to develop in an undesirable way, bypassing the usual bureaucratic chain. The entire rest of the day before the meeting passed for me in a state of strange, almost detached calmness, familiar to me from years of working with particularly complex and risky audits. My body, apparently, was saving its strength for the upcoming tension, shutting off excess emotions, and focusing exclusively on the practical details of the upcoming evening. I once again double-checked the functionality of the Panic Button app, made sure that the watch recording audio was fully charged, and left my phone, contrary to usual, not in my purse but in the inner pocket of my jacket, from where it would be harder to take it from me unnoticed if the conversation really took an unfavorable turn. On the way to my mother-in-law's Gold Coast building, I suddenly caught myself remembering that very first dinner where Cordelia questioned me about my work with such flawless affability, and I thought about how bizarrely circles sometimes close. Back then, I was a potential threat to her, the degree of danger of which she could only vaguely guess, whereas now, years later, this threat had acquired the very concrete shape of a federal subpoena ready to take effect within the next few days. And she herself, by all appearances, had decided on a step from which it would be impossible to turn back under any circumstances. I felt neither triumph nor gloating at this thought, rather a calm, illusion-free readiness to see the climax of a story that I had been leading for a long time, with full awareness of my own responsibility for every decision made. And it was exactly this inner readiness, as I understand now, looking back, that allowed me to maintain my composure at the moment when events in my mother-in-law's condo began to unfold according to a scenario much harsher and much more frankly criminal than I, for all my professional suspiciousness, had managed to imagine in advance. Callum, who had picked me up on the way to his mother's, looked unusually pale and silent. To my direct question about whether he knew exactly what his mother was going to talk to me about, he merely shrugged, repeating that she had asked him not to interfere in anything and just be there. An answer that, as I understood much later, meant that Cordelia had planned from the very beginning to use her son not in the role of a peacemaker, which he himself probably still naively imagined, but in the role of the direct executor of the climax she had prepared in advance, having carefully thought through every detail of the upcoming evening. It was at this moment, when objectively I was closest to completing a long and dangerous job, that my mother-in-law, somehow sensing something was wrong, either through her own connections in the banking sector, or thanks to panicked rumors spreading among the founders of the affiliated LLCs, made the decision to act immediately, without waiting for official notification of the asset freeze. She organized that very evening visit to her apartment, where I, suspecting nothing of the degree of her awareness, was invited under a plausible pretext by Callum himself. He said that his mother was unwell and wanted to discuss something important with me in a calm home environment. An invitation that I, accustomed to such family visits, accepted without the slightest alarm, not even suspecting that I was walking toward an ending much more dramatic than any of my own carefully calculated professional assumptions. Cordelia herself opened the door for me, and by the very practiced, almost theatrical affability with which she invited me to come in, spreading her arms in the gesture of a welcoming hostess expecting a dear guest, I was finally convinced of the correctness of my own suspicions. Before me stood a person who had carefully rehearsed every sentence of the upcoming conversation long before my appearance on the threshold. And the only thing this woman didn't know yet was that her daughter-in-law was coming to this meeting by no means empty-handed, and by no means alone, if by loneliness one counts the absence of anyone nearby besides, a phone in the inner pocket of a jacket and a recording watch on the wrist. The living room where I was escorted was furnished with that deliberate respectability usually demonstrated by people accustomed to impressing outsiders with their wealth. Heavy drapes, an antique-looking credenza lined with porcelain, and a large, mirror-polished table where Cordelia, contrary to usual, did not offer me a drink, but immediately got down to business. She seated me in an armchair opposite her, while Callum remained standing by the window, avoiding meeting my gaze with a persistence that in itself already said more than any words could. Delphine, my mother-in-law, began in that same soft, insinuating tone with which she had spoken to me on the phone a few days ago. I thought a long time before inviting you here, and decided that the time has come to speak frankly, without omissions, which have poisoned the relationships in our family for too long. And therefore, I want to ask you directly, where is the money that you removed from the Foundation's documents under the guise of an internal audit? This question, delivered with the intonation of a person pre-convinced of their own rightness, would have caught off guard anyone who truly had nothing to do with the movement of the Foundation's funds. However, it only strengthened my understanding of how desperately my mother-in-law was trying to build an alternative version of events capable of turning me from a prosecution witness into the main suspect before the federal order to freeze the assets was officially executed. I answered her with absolute calmness, looking straight into her eyes, that I had not the slightest relation to any disappearance of Foundation funds. That all my work with the Foundation's documents was carried out exclusively within the framework of a review coordinated with the holding company's corporate security, the existence of which Cordelia was apparently already perfectly aware of, and that if she really wanted to speak frankly, she should first explain where a significant part of the donations from large corporate donors flowing through nonprofits affiliated with her, had disappeared over the course of several years. My mother-in-law's face for a moment twisted into that very grimace of undisguised hatred that she had carefully hidden for so many years behind the mask of a welcoming hostess. Rising from her chair and approaching me closely, she said, no longer with her former insinuation, but with frank, undisguised threat in her voice, that I would still have the opportunity to regret my own insolence. Because, apparently, I still hadn't understood who I was dealing with, and what a family whose prosperity I was trying to destroy with my papers and audits was ready to do. Callum, who had been silent by the window until then, stepped forward, as if intending to intervene and stop the conversation taking a frankly threatening turn. However, his mother stopped him with a sharp gesture, uttering a phrase whose meaning I realized only a few seconds later. Sit down and don't interfere. I will deal with this matter myself, the way it needs to be dealt with. A phrase that sounded so authoritative and so customary for this woman that my husband, contrary to his own first impulse, obediently sank back onto a chair, demonstrating by his whole appearance that even now, on the threshold of outright violence, he was not ready to openly go against his mother's will. I rose from the chair, intending to leave the apartment, since a conversation stripped of any constructive content and transitioning into direct threats no longer made the slightest sense to me. However, Cordelia, anticipating my intention, blocked the path to the door, and then, turning to her son, uttered a phrase, hearing which I felt for a split second a real, unmasked chill inside, despite all my professional preparation for the worst-case scenario. Hold her, Callum. She is not leaving here until she tells the truth. What happened in the next few minutes I subsequently reconstructed from memory for the official record, trying to stick exclusively to facts and not to the emotions overflowing in me at the moment of the event itself. Callum, obeying his mother's direct order, grabbed me by the shoulders with a force completely uncharacteristic of the former soft and indecisive man I had known for many years of our marriage. He tried to hold me in place. As I broke free from his grip, I lost my balance and fell to the living room floor, hitting my elbow and shoulder against the hard flooring with such force that for a moment everything went dark before my eyes from the sharp pain that pierced my whole body. And right then, lying on the floor and trying to catch my breath, I heard the words that, as I firmly knew already at that moment, would forever change the future fate of everyone present in this room. Why are you just holding her? Hit her harder. Just not on the face, so it doesn't leave marks. In a couple of minutes, she'll tell us exactly where she hid the money herself. Cordelia screamed at her son, who stood over me with a raised hand. And in this scream, there was not a drop of maternal hysteria or temporary insanity. There was only the cold, years-practiced confidence of a person accustomed to getting her way by any available means, and genuinely believing that physical pain is capable of loosening the tongue of someone who is truly hiding something. I lay on the floor, feeling a pulsating pain in my shoulder and elbow. Blood flowed down my cheek from an eyebrow split during the fall. However, instead of panic or pleading for mercy, which my mother-in-law apparently expected from me, that same cold analytical mechanism turned on inside me that for years had helped find solutions in the most tangled financial structures. I clearly realized that every word spoken now was being recorded by the watch on my wrist, that the phone in the inner pocket of my jacket, thrown on the armchair by the entrance, had already sent a distress signal the moment Callum first grabbed me by the shoulders, and that somewhere on the approach to this building, at this very second, there were already people whose appearance here would produce an effect much more destructive to this family than any number of bruises I could receive in the next few minutes. "Thank you," I said in a quiet but absolutely even voice, slowly rising on my elbows and looking straight into Cordelia's face, frozen in surprise. Those were exactly the words I needed today to complete the picture. My mother-in-law froze for a moment, clearly not expecting such a reaction from a beaten woman lying on the floor, instead of the usual tears or frightened excuses. And Callum, who had been standing with his hand raised, suddenly recoiled backward, as if the meaning of his own action had only just fully reached him. He muttered something incoherent about how he didn't mean to, that his mother provoked him, that he himself didn't understand what came over him. Excuses that at this moment interested me no more than the excuses of a random passerby, because much more important was what was happening right now in the pocket of my jacket, where the phone continued to fix the exact GPS coordinates of this apartment for those who were to arrive here in the coming minutes. "What bruises are you talking about, Cordelia?" I asked, rising to my feet with a dignity that, as I managed to notice, finally knocked my mother-in-law off balance, stronger than any direct threats on my part. "You just, in front of witnesses, including your own son, demanded aloud that I be beaten in order to extract a confession for something I never committed. This is not a family argument. This is incitement to assault, recorded, by the way, in the minutest detail." Taking the phone out of my jacket pocket, the screen of which lit up with the confirmation of the sent distress signal, indicating the exact time and geolocation, I showed it to my mother-in-law, continuing to speak in the same even voice, devoid of any dramatization. "Literally, at the moment your son first grabbed me by the shoulders, this device automatically sent a message about what was happening simultaneously to several recipients, among whom is not only my family, but also the federal division that has been investigating your foundation for several months. An investigation in which I, for your information, from the very beginning, did not act as a random daughter-in-law showing excessive curiosity, but as an officially engaged specialist working under appropriate cover." Cordelia's face at this moment underwent an amazing metamorphosis. From the triumphant anger read in every feature a minute ago to the frank, undisguised terror of a person who suddenly realized the scale of her own catastrophic mistake. "You couldn't have," she whispered, taking a step back. "You're just an ordinary audit employee. You have nothing to do with the feds. It's impossible to check that deeply in such a time." I smiled back at her with the same cold directness with which I usually answered interlocutors' attempts to dispute obvious numbers in a financial report. "Perhaps you should have taken an interest in my qualifications a little more carefully that evening, when you first asked me about my work with such close interest. Instead of deciding that before you was an ordinary, modest daughter-in-law, incapable of seeing a scheme for siphoning off other people's money behind the facade of philanthropy." Exactly at this second, when the tension in the room seemed to have reached its breaking point, the doorbell rang. This ring, sharp and persistent, sounded so unexpected in the hanging silence that even Callum, who had been in a state of complete stupor until then, shuddered with his whole body. Cordelia shot a quick glance towards the door, and then back at me. And in this look, there was no longer triumph or rage, but the most genuine animal fear of a person realizing that events were spinning out of control much faster than they had calculated. Behind the door, however, was not a beat cop, whose appearance would have been expected first and foremost, but a man in a strict business suit who introduced himself as Montgomery, a business partner of the foundation and, as it turned out, literally in the next minute, a person whose existence I knew from documents exclusively as one of the formal founders of an affiliated LLC, but had never considered as an independent player in this story. Montgomery, entering the apartment uninvited and clearly not noticing, or rather, intentionally ignoring my presence on the living room floor with obvious signs of violence, turned straight to Cordelia with the intonation of a person who had completely lost patience. Cordelia, we have a problem much more serious than your family squabbles. The bank froze all the foundation's accounts this morning, and my lawyer says the freeze is placed not only on the organization's assets, but also personally on your accounts, including those whose existence I was sure no one besides the two of us suspected. These words, uttered by a seemingly completely outside person, produced the effect of an exploding bomb, much more destructive than any of my own statements a few minutes earlier. For they sounded not like a threat from a supposed opponent, but as confirmation of an accomplished fact from the lips of her own business partner, who even that morning, by all appearances, did not suspect the operation being prepared against him. Cordelia turned so pale that for a moment it seemed to me she was about to lose consciousness. And, turning to Montgomery, she tried to object. However, he, finally noticing me with obvious signs of being beaten, froze mid-sentence, and then slowly shifted his gaze back to his business partner, with the expression of a man beginning to understand that he was dragged into a story whose scale of consequences for him personally was only just beginning to emerge. "Did you beat your daughter-in-law?" he uttered in a quiet, hoarse voice, addressing both Cordelia and Callum, who was frozen by the window. "Do you realize that if this becomes known to the investigators and, judging by everything, it already has charges of assault and battery will be added to the charge of wire fraud? I didn't turn a blind eye to some peculiarities of your reporting for years just to end up implicated in a criminal case for domestic violence." At this moment, observing the panic rapidly unfolding before my eyes of two people who until recently seemed to me absolutely confident in their own invulnerability, I rose to my feet, leaning on the back of the nearest chair, and uttered a phrase that I subsequently remembered more than once as a kind of point of no return for this entire story. "I suppose, Montgomery, you should contact your lawyer right now, because in the next few minutes, officers will arrive here whose job will be to document not only the fact of physical violence applied to me, but also the entire complex of materials collected as part of the investigation into the Foundation's activities. And considering that you just voluntarily, in the presence of a witness, virtually confirmed your own awareness of violations in the reporting, your position looks little better than the position of Cordelia herself." What turned out to be much more important at that moment was that Callum, who had been silent all these minutes, suddenly rushed to me, reaching out a hand and trying to help me up, muttering apologies mixed with attempts to explain his own behavior by a sudden clouding of reason under his mother's pressure. However, I pushed his hand away with a sharp but not aggressive movement, looking him straight in the eye with the same cold directness with which I had looked at his mother a few minutes earlier. "Don't touch me," I said quietly, but with such inner firmness that he recoiled as if he had been slapped. "You just now, on the direct order of your own mother, caused me physical pain, hoping to beat out of me a confession for something I didn't do. And I no longer intend to pretend that such behavior can be explained by weakness of character or years of maternal pressure. This was your own choice, made in a specific moment, and you will have to bear the consequences of this choice yourself." Just then, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was indeed a group of arriving officers, among whom, to my relief, I immediately recognized Kerrigan, who arrived with a tactical team much faster than I could have expected within the framework of a normal response to a panic signal. This circumstance was explained literally a minute later, when she, casting a quick professional glance over the crime scene and my obvious injuries, quietly informed me that the operation to detain the suspects in the case was scheduled for this evening anyway, due to confirmed information about the threat of destroying the remaining documentary evidence. My panic button call merely accelerated the already planned actions by literally a few minutes. Cordelia, seeing the uniforms and badges of the arriving officers, attempted to play the victim, claiming that her daughter-in-law had invaded her home and provoked a domestic conflict. However, Kerrigan, ignoring these statements with the professional calmness of a person who had heard such excuses dozens of times before, asked everyone present to remain in place until the preliminary inspection was completed and a report was drawn up. She separately clarified with me whether I was ready to provide the audio recording I had of the incident as evidence. I confirmed my readiness without the slightest hesitation, understanding that exactly this recording, fixing Cordelia's direct demand to use physical force against me, would become a key element of the prosecution, not only for charity fraud, but also in a separate, much more severe crime against a person. The EMT team, which arrived along with the task force, documented the injuries I had received. A split eyebrow, bruises on my shoulder and elbow, and a hematoma beginning to show on my forearm, compiling a detailed report necessary later for the forensic medical examination. Meanwhile, the FBI agents working the economic crimes angle began seizing documentation discovered right in Cordelia's apartment, including several folders with notes that, judging by a cursory review, contained much more frank information about the real movement of the Foundation's funds over recent years than the official SEC filings. Callum, watching what was happening with the expression of a person who had completely lost the ground beneath his feet, tried once more to appeal to me with a request to hear his version of events. However, feeling the receding tension being replaced by a deep, all-consuming fatigue, I merely shook my head, saying that he could give all his explanations to the prosecution. From me, in this apartment, he had nothing more to expect except one thing. Tomorrow morning, I will file for divorce. And considering what happened today, I will insist that our subsequent divorce and property division proceed with the maximum possible consideration of the assault you committed. One of the agents, however, was much more interested not in my reaction to what was happening, but in the degree of Callum's own awareness of the Mothers Foundation's activities. And when asked to answer whether he knew about the real nature of the movement of funds through the affiliated organizations, my husband, to my own surprise, answered not with his usual evasive mumbling, but surprisingly directly, as if the violence that occurred had somehow paradoxically deprived him of the last strength to pretend to be uninvolved. He admitted that over the past year he had periodically signed documents, the contents of which his mother asked him not to read too carefully, explaining it by the need to speed up bureaucratic procedures. He confessed that somewhere deep down he always suspected something was wrong, but preferred not to ask unnecessary questions, because any attempt to doubt the correctness of maternal decisions invariably turned into multi-day cold silences for him. Or, what was even harder, disappointed, looks full of hidden reproach, which he feared stronger than any open scandals. This confession, uttered in the presence of an investigator literally minutes after Callum had caused me physical pain at the direct instruction of his mother, became the second revelation for me that evening, finally putting an end to the illusion I was still trying to maintain by inertia regarding the degree of his personal responsibility. Before me was not just a weak-willed person, incapable of resisting outside pressure for years, but a person quite consciously turning a blind eye to the obvious signs of his own mother's criminal activity for the sake of maintaining customary family peace, which meant his own guilt in what happened turned out to be significantly weightier than could be explained by just a momentary clouding of reason under a mother's scream. Montgomery, whom the officers also asked not to leave the premises until the completion of initial investigative actions, stood against the wall with his phone in his hands, apparently unsuccessfully trying to reach his lawyer. And he looked so confused that even Cordelia, who until recently seemed to me the embodiment of indestructible dominance, now looked next to him more like an accomplice, who found herself equally unprepared for such a turn of events, rather than the former confident master of the situation. Kerrigan, having finished the preliminary questioning of everyone present, walked over to me and, lowering her voice so as not to be heard by the others, reported one more detail, the significance of which I fully realized only a few days later. During the analysis of the seized documents, the investigation already had information that the real scale of the scheme significantly exceeded initial estimates. Among the ultimate recipients of the siphoned funds appeared the name of a person occupying a fairly prominent position in regional political circles. His participation in this story, according to her words, was capable of turning the case from a local family scandal into a much more high-profile federal investigation, the consequences of which would affect significantly more people than those present today, in this living room. Leaving the apartment, where just recently I was demanded to be beaten for the sake of obtaining a confession for a non-existent crime, I turned around for a moment to see the final picture of this evening. Cordelia, clutching her head in her hands, sat on that very sofa where a few hours ago she had so confidently planned my humiliation. Callum stood by the window with the look of a person left without anyone's support for the first time in his life, forced to independently realize the consequences of his own actions. And Montgomery continued to unsuccessfully dial his lawyer's number, clearly understanding that no call could cancel what had happened in this room over the last half hour. I spent the night at my parents' house, where, following Kerrigan's strong recommendation, one of the officers drove me immediately after the completion of the preliminary investigative actions. My father, Seeing me on the threshold with a bandaged eyebrow and obvious signs of the trauma I had experienced, didn't ask unnecessary questions, just hugged me tightly and said those very words that I seemed to have been waiting to hear all this long. Exhausting evening. You handled it. And that's the most important thing. We'll sort out everything else tomorrow with a fresh head. I didn't manage to fall asleep right away that night. Lying in the dark of my old childhood room, I mentally replayed the events of the past evening, trying to understand exactly what I felt now that the months of tension had finally resolved in such a dramatic but, in its own way, logical manner. With some surprise, I found inside myself not so much relief or triumph as a calm, unsentimental readiness to move forward, dealing in order with all the consequences of today's evening, no matter how long and tiresome this path turned out to be. The next morning, Kerrigan called with news that, despite my professional preparedness for unexpected twists, still made me freeze for a moment with the phone in my hand. An urgent analysis of the seized documents overnight revealed that the person whose involvement Kerrigan had mentioned the night before, that prominent figure in local circles, had over the past few years been using Cordelia's foundation to actually finance his own political campaign for state. Anator. He was using charitable donations as a convenient channel to bypass official campaign finance limits. This meant that the case, which initially seemed like a story of one domineering mother-in-law and her spineless son, was rapidly growing into a much larger federal investigation, with political consequences that would be fully felt in the very near future. Kerrigan also clarified that the identity of this person, whose name appeared in the documents under the guise of an ordinary major donor, was established by comparing bank transfers with the dates of campaign registration fees. It was a coincidence that immediately alerted investigators, because the timing of the funds received from the foundation almost perfectly overlapped with key stages of the election race held a year earlier. This man, whose name was not yet subject to disclosure until all circumstances were verified, was apparently the ultimate beneficiary of the scheme. It was for his interests that Cordelia was ready to resort to any methods, including frankly criminal ones, to preserve the secret, a circumstance fully explaining the degree of desperation that pushed her to a decision that a month ago would have seemed unthinkable even to herself. That afternoon, I had to go to the trauma clinic for an official forensic medical evaluation. Not the most pleasant procedure, but necessary for the further processing of the assault charges against Callum and his mother. The medical examiner, carefully photographing each injury and recording its nature in the protocol, noted in passing that such trauma, judging by their location and nature, indeed corresponded to the mechanism of injury I described, and not to any other alternative explanation that the opposing side would likely try to offer in the event of a trial. This formal, emotionless phrase from a specialist, accustomed to dealing exclusively with facts and not with other people's stories, somehow brought me more peace at that moment than any words of sympathy I could have heard from relatives or friends. Perhaps it was because objective, independent documentation of facts over the past months was the only language I was used to speaking with the outside world, trusting numbers and reports significantly more than emotional assurances. At work, where I returned 2 days after the incident, despite my parents' persistent entreaties to take sick leave and get a proper rest, I was met with that restrained but sincere support that, admittedly, I had not expected to receive in such a situation. My colleagues, some of whom were already aware of my hidden role in the investigation of the Foundation's activities, treated what happened not with idle curiosity, but with the professional respect of people who understand the price one sometimes has to pay to see a complex case through. The director of corporate security, calling me in for a short conversation, thanked me for the endurance and professionalism I showed. He specially noted that my readiness to complete the investigation, despite the obvious personal risk, became one of the decisive factors that prevented the further destruction of evidence and the withdrawal of the remaining funds beyond the reach of the FBI. A few days later, I received a call from the attorney I had retained on Kerrigan's recommendation to handle the divorce proceedings and simultaneously represent me as a victim in the criminal case. Ignatius, a man not young but extremely meticulous about details, explained the procedure for further actions to me with the same methodical thoroughness I was accustomed to in my own professional environment. First, it was necessary to officially file the divorce petition, since living together after what happened was out of the question in principle. Second, a separate statement had to be filed as part of the criminal case concerning the infliction of bodily harm and incitement to it. And finally, third, It was worth preparing in advance for the fact that Cordelia's defense and her lawyers would most likely try to present what happened as a spontaneous family conflict, provoked by my own excessive persistence in matters concerning the Forsything Foundation. Therefore, I needed to document the entire history of our relationship from the very beginning as detailed and consistently as possible, while avoiding any emotional exaggerations capable of being subsequently used against me in a deposition. Ignatius also warned me about another circumstance that, according to him, could significantly complicate further proceedings. Because the case was taking on a political hue due to the involvement of the person who financed his election campaign, there was a very real probability that interested parties would try to exert pressure on the course of the investigation through their own connections in local government. This meant I had to be prepared for the fact that the process might drag out significantly longer than an ordinary divorce case lacking such aggravating circumstances. I took this warning calmly, answering the attorney that I was ready for any development of events. The main decision to go to the end, not stopping halfway for the sake of my own convenience, had been made by me long before yesterday evening, and to retreat from it now would mean betraying myself and the work I had been doing for many long months, with full awareness of the possible consequences. About a week after the incident, Cordelia herself called me, which was almost as unexpected an event for me as her recent invitation to the fateful conversation. My mother-in-law's voice this time sounded completely different, devoid of its former authority and confidence. It was rather tinged with a desperate, almost pathetic attempt to reach the person on whom a significant part of her own fate now depended. She started talking about how perhaps we could resolve all this amicably, without a trial and criminal prosecution, offering me some monetary compensation for the harm caused on the condition that I drop further claims and not insist on a restraining order and criminal case. It was a proposal uttered with that characteristic mixture of ostentatious humility and hidden calculation, which had long ceased to make any impression on me. I answered her shortly, and without the slightest ambiguity. What had happened was not an issue that could be settled with money. We were not talking about a personal grievance subject to material compensation, but about a crime committed against me that affected the interests of a significantly larger number of people than she, by all appearances, still realized, including those very beneficiaries whose donations had been misused for years. Cordelia, hearing this answer, attempted to shift to direct threats, reminding me of her connections and that such a proceeding could seriously complicate my own career. However, listening to this tirade with my former calmness, I merely noted that a person whose name already appeared in federal case files for wire fraud on a massive scale was hardly in a position to threaten anyone, after which I ended the call, not waiting for further attempts at pressure on her part. In parallel with these events, my own recovery continued, both physical and emotional. The bruises gradually faded, the split eyebrow healed, leaving a barely noticeable scar. But the internal perception of what happened required significantly more time for complete comprehension. I caught myself thinking that, despite all the professionalism with which I prepared for the possible physical escalation of events, the very fact that a person with whom I shared a home for several years turned out to be capable of raising a hand against me at the direct demand of his own mother continued to evoke in me a deep shock requiring processing something much more complex than simple disappointment in a failed marriage. 2 weeks after the incident, the first official meeting took place with the federal prosecutor assigned to lead the combined case on the charity fraud and the assault. At this meeting, I was informed that the investigation, initially centered around the activities of Cordelia's foundation, was indeed expanding much faster than originally anticipated. Besides the already mentioned politician who financed his campaign through charitable channels, several other people from my mother-in-law's inner circle were implicated in the case. This included the foundation's CPA, who had filed fictitious returns for years, and a corporate lawyer who advised Cordelia on minimizing the risks of exposure. This was a circumstance unambiguously indicating that unfolding before the investigators was not the story of one domineering woman, but a full-fledged, well-organized criminal syndicate that had operated for many years with the silent or direct participation of a whole circle of people. The first court hearing on the assault charge against Callum took place about a month after that evening. I appeared in court composed and outwardly calm, although I felt the internal tension before the upcoming proceedings significantly sharper than I was ready to show to others. Callum looked depressed and haggard. His defense attorney, trying to build a line of defense around the thesis of the spontaneity of what happened and the lack of direct intent to cause harm, appealed to the idea that my ex-husband supposedly acted under the influence of strong emotional shock provoked by his mother's words, and not with a conscious desire to cause me pain. After listening to the Apple Watch audio recording presented by the prosecution, however, the judge did not find this version convincing. The judge specifically noted in the ruling that the content of the recording left no doubt about the conscious actions of both participants in the incident, and the very fact of using force at the direct demand of a third party could not be considered a mitigating circumstance, since the guilty party possessed the full opportunity to refuse to fulfill such a demand. At a separate point in this same hearing, the testimony of Montgomery was heard. To my slight surprise, he decided to cooperate with the authorities, calculating, by all appearances, to mitigate his own responsibility by providing extensive testimony about the mechanism of the slush fund scheme. His account, much more detailed and much more compromising for Cordelia than one could expect from a business partner accustomed to keeping shared secrets for years, added a significant volume of new facts for the prosecution. It included exact amounts and dates of key transactions, which previously could only be reconstructed indirectly through the analysis of scattered documentation. The court, having considered the materials of the case, found Callum guilty of misdemeanor assault, assigning him probation, and specifically indicating that this fact was subject to mandatory consideration in the further proceedings of the accompanying civil case on divorce and division of property. The materials regarding Cordelia as the instigator were separated into federal proceedings due to the significantly greater severity of the charges brought against her, which combined both the episode with physical violence and the primary, much larger-scale charge of wire fraud involving charitable funds. After the hearing, leaving the courthouse, I ran into Callum in the hallway. He tried to talk to me, uttering confused words about repentance and readiness to fix everything at any cost. However, I stopped him with a short but decisive gesture. I answered that I had heard enough explanations from him over the years of living together, and that the only thing that interested me now in relations with him was the procedure for the further legal formalization of the divorce, and not his personal feelings about his own moral collapse. He fell silent, lowering his head, and I walked to my car without looking back, leaving behind not only this specific person, but also that whole version of my own life, in which I had once agreed to put up with someone else's weakness for the sake of the illusion of family prosperity. A few days later, Kerrigan gave me the final news of that moment, which became a kind of summary of the first, most dramatic stage of this whole story. The scale of the revealed scheme turned out to be so significant that the case was transferred to the jurisdiction of a federal grand jury specializing in particularly large economic crimes. The number of suspects, originally limited to Cordelia and her inner circle, had by this point grown to 7 people. This included the mentioned politician, the foundation's CPA, the consulting lawyer, and several formal founders of affiliated LLCs. Each of them, as the investigation developed, began to testify, striving to shift the main burden of responsibility onto the other participants in the scheme. I listened to this news standing by the window of my townhouse, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel something akin to satisfaction, not a gloating triumph over a defeated opponent, but the calm, professional confidence of a person who had seen a complex, risky job through to that boundary beyond which the further course of events is determined no longer by my personal efforts, but by the objective logic of the law. It was a confidence, however, which I still had to test in the course of a much larger judicial proceeding that awaited ahead, and in which the main role was to be played not by the emotions of one specific evening, but by cold, irrefutable facts accumulated over long months of painstaking, dangerous work. My mother, having learned about the expansion of the case to the scale of a federal investigation, remarked one day at dinner with a phrase that seemed to me, then, an amazingly accurate summary of everything that had happened. You knew from the very beginning that you were dealing not with an ordinary family quarrel, but with a real war, where not only feelings but money were at stake. And wars, as is known, rarely end with a single battle. She turned out to be right significantly more than I was ready to admit at that moment, still harboring the illusion that the hardest part of the story was left behind along with that evening in my mother-in-law's living room. My father, in turn, much more restrained in expressing emotions, limited himself to a short, but in its own way exhaustive remark, repeating that same phrase he used to say to me in childhood: "If you are right, stand your ground to the end. without shouting and fuss, and the result will inevitably come by itself, even if not as fast as you would like. Words that I took that evening not as consolation, but as a reminder that ahead of me awaited a long, exhausting journey through court hearings, depositions, and cross-examinations before it would be possible to say with full justification that justice had truly prevailed, not only concerning me personally, but concerning all those people whose donations for many years had been misused to satisfy someone else's ambitions and someone else's greed. It was during these days that I happened to personally meet with that very woman, the director of the small regional organization helping large families, whose testimony had become one of the first weighty pieces of evidence in the case. She called me herself, having learned through mutual acquaintances about my role in exposing the scheme. Meeting with me in a small cafe not far from the courthouse, with tears in her eyes, she told me how many families over the past few years had fallen short of promised aid because a significant portion of the funds intended for them settled in the accounts of shell organizations and never reached those who truly needed it. She thanked me for the persistence with which I saw the matter through to the end, admitting that she herself for a long time did not dare to file an official complaint, fearing Cordelia's connections in local government, and not believing in the real possibility of achieving justice against a person of such standing. This conversation made a significantly stronger impression on me than any dry numbers from the financial reports I had been working with over the past months. For the first time in all this time, I saw not an abstract embezzlement scheme recorded in documents, but living people whose fates were mutilated by someone else's greed and cynicism, hiding behind noble slogans of charity. And this realization only strengthened my resolve to go to the end in the upcoming federal trial, regardless of how much more time and emotional strength this path would require. The full federal trial for the main criminal case began several months after that evening in Cordelia's living room, and these months, contrary to my initial expectations of a temporary lull, turned out to be filled with dense, exhausting work. As a key witness for the prosecution, I was regularly called in for additional questioning, asked to clarify details of previously submitted documents, and participate in depositions with other suspects in the case. The number of indicted individuals had grown to 9 by the time the trial started, including the already mentioned state senator Hopeful, whose name by that time had ceased to be a secret and had become headline news in local business publications. The scandal around the financing of his election campaign through charitable channels erupted with such force that he had to resign from his current post even before official charges were brought. His own attempts to present what happened as a misunderstanding caused by the dishonesty of subordinates were shattered against that same audio recording and the same documentation that I had once handed over to investigators while still an unknown employee of the Internal Audit Department. Cordelia, contrary to my expectations, tried until the last to build her own line of defense around the image of an elderly, misled woman who had fallen victim to more cunning and experienced business partners. It was a version that perhaps would have had a chance of success, if not for dozens of documents bearing her personal signature, confirming not passive complicity, but active, meticulously thought-out leadership of the entire scheme over many years. Her high-priced defense attorney, invited, judging by his reputation, as one of the most expensive in Chicago, also tried to cast doubt on the legality of my participation in the investigation. He hinted that the actions of an internal auditor conducting a covert check of the activities of her own husband's relatives might contain signs of entrapment or exceeding authority. An argument shattered in court by the representative of corporate security from my holding company, who presented a full package of documents confirming the official, SECANT-compliant engagement of my services for the audit long before I knew anything about the real scale of the violations. The trial stretched out over multiple sessions, each of which added new, increasingly incriminating details to the overall picture of what had happened. The prosecution methodically, document by document, reconstructed the complete chain of movement of funds from corporate donors through the 501c3 to the personal accounts of Cordelia and affiliated persons. Meanwhile, the defense, deprived of the opportunity to dispute objective bank statements, tried to focus on procedural technicalities, filing motions to exclude certain evidence and insisting on the appointment of repeat expert analyses, a tactic that, however, merely dragged out the process, not giving the defendant any real chance of acquittal. Watching these attempts from the courtroom, where I was present as a key prosecution witness, I felt not the slightest gloating over the obvious doom of the defense. Rather, It was the calm, professional satisfaction of a person seeing how the evidentiary base she built withstood any attempts to cast doubt on it, leaving the jury no room for any decision other than a guilty verdict. A particularly tense session was the one where Callum's testimony was heard. By this point, he had already gone through his own sentencing for causing me bodily harm and, by all appearances, had finally realized that further concealment of information was only capable of worsening his own position. He told the court with a degree of frankness I had never noticed in him before about how, over the course of several years, his mother gradually trained him to sign documents, the contents of which he tried not to analyze too carefully. He spoke of the regular demands to keep details of family financial affairs secret from me, and also about that very evening when, succumbing to his mother's direct pressure, he committed an act for which, in his own words, he would bear responsibility for the rest of his life. Listening to this testimony, I felt neither gloating nor sympathy. Only a calm, detached understanding that before me stood a person who finally dared to call things by their proper names, although it was too late for this decision to change anything in our personal relationship. The divorce, finalized several months before the start of the main trial, went much faster and calmer than one might assume, considering all the drama of the preceding events. The Lincoln Park townhouse, inherited by me long before the marriage, unconditionally remained my property, which the judge confirmed without the slightest hesitation. The meager marital property, limited to a car and modest savings in a joint account, was divided equally without any disputes on my part. Engaging in a property dispute with a man whose family was already under federal indictment for grand larceny held no practical sense for me whatsoever. Callum, to his credit, did not contest the division of assets, merely remarking once during the signing of papers that he understood that preserving the remnants of his own dignity was the most he could hope to get out of this story anymore. During one of the sessions, another victim testified before the court, whose existence the prosecution learned about only at a late stage of the investigation. An elderly woman who had at one time transferred to Cordelia's foundation a significant portion of her personal savings, left after selling her own home, being convinced by the foundation's promotional materials that the funds would go toward building a shelter for lonely elderly people lacking family support. This shelter, as it turned out during the trial, was never built, and the funds collected for this specific project were simply dissolved in the general cash flow directed to the personal needs of the scheme's organizers. It was a story that sounded in the courtroom with such piercing simplicity and such absence of any dramatization on the part of the victim herself that even the seasoned participants in the process plunged into a heavy, awkward silence for a moment. It was exactly after this testimony, as Kerrigan noted later, that the presiding federal judge, judging by the intonation of subsequent questions to the defendant, finally formed an attitude toward the nature and scale of the harm caused, significantly exceeding the initial purely financial estimates of the damages. The verdict in the main criminal case was read out after several more months of intensive court hearings, and it turned out to be significantly harsher than Cordelia's defense had originally anticipated. The jury found her guilty of organizing and directing a scheme to embezzle charitable funds on a massive scale, as well as racketeering and wire fraud, and the judge sentenced her to a real term in federal prison. It was a decision that, as Kerrigan informed me later, became one of the most high-profile sentences for economic crimes in recent years in our state, precisely thanks to the unprecedented completeness of the collected evidentiary base. Montgomery, who actively cooperated with the authorities at all stages of the proceedings, received a significantly lighter, suspended sentence, which caused a certain dissatisfaction among some beneficiaries harmed by the scheme. However, the U.S. Attorney insisted on such a decision exactly because of the value of the testimony he provided for the completeness of the prosecution against the other suspects. The former politician, whose involvement in the case caused the greatest reputational damage, received a separate sentence under statutes for illegal financing of an election campaign and abuse of office, thereby completely ending his once promising career. Callum, whose degree of guilt the court assessed as significantly less severe compared to his mother, since his participation was limited to signing documents without a deep understanding of their true purpose, avoided federal prison for the main fraud case. He got off with probation for the assault episode. However, the reputational consequences of this story, judging by information reaching me through mutual acquaintances, turned out to be no less destructive for him than for the other figures. He lost his job in the family structure. Deprived of all assets, he was forced to start his professional life anew, in the most basic entry-level positions, and relations with his mother, now serving her sentence, were reduced to rare formal correspondence, devoid of the former emotional dependence that once defined literally every decision he made. About 2 months after the sentence entered into legal force, I received a letter through my lawyer from Cordelia herself, sent from a federal correctional facility. This letter, contrary to my initial fears, contained neither threats nor attempts to shift responsibility onto others, but turned out to be surprisingly restrained and in its own way honest. She wrote that the long months spent in conditions deprived of her former power and customary control over circumstances forced her for the first time in her life to think about what her own value system had turned into over the years of building the foundation. It was initially conceived, in her words, with a sincere desire to help people, but was gradually replaced by a craving for personal enrichment and absolute power over her own family. She did not ask for forgiveness directly, realizing, judging by the tone of the letter, that such a request would sound false and inappropriate after everything that had happened. However, she expressed a kind of unsentimental gratitude that I did not allow her to bring her own degradation to even more destructive consequences for her son and those around her. I read this letter twice, trying to understand my own reaction to such an unexpected confession, and ultimately decided not to answer it. Not out of vindictiveness or a desire to continue the punishment beyond what the court had already assigned, but from a firm understanding that further communication with a person who for years had built against me and against dozens of outside people, such a sophisticated and ruthless web of deceit would bring me nothing but a vain waste of emotional strength, which would be much more sensibly directed toward my own recovery and further professional development. I did, however, show this letter to my parents, considering it dishonest to hide such a development of events from them. My father, having read it silently and returning the pages to me without a single comment, merely noted that such late epiphanies, for all their apparent sincerity, changed nothing in the objective assessment of what was done. And my mother added that a truly repentant person usually looks for a way to compensate for the harm caused through deeds, and not just with letters, even if written with the best intentions. An observation that seemed particularly accurate to me then, considering that Cordelia, as far as I knew, had not made the slightest attempt to compensate for the damage to the people who suffered from her scheme, beyond what was forcibly collected by the court's decision in restitution. One day, about a year after the divorce, Callum tracked me down through mutual acquaintances with a request for a short meeting, explaining this by a desire to say what, according to him, had long required being said aloud, rather than remaining an unspoken burden. We met in a neutral, emotionless place, a small coffee shop near the Dirksen Federal Building, where a few months earlier, the final verdict in his mother's case had been read, looking at me without his former confusion, but also without attempts to make excuses. He said that over the past year, for the first time in his life, he had begun making decisions independently, without looking back at someone else's opinion. He said that what happened, no matter how destructive it was for him personally, became the only real push for him to finally grow up and stop being a person for whom others make all life decisions. I listened to this confession calmly, without gloating and without sympathy, answering only that I was glad for any sincere movement towards independence, but that such realizations, unfortunately, come to people most often exactly when the price paid for the lesson turns out to be exorbitantly high for everyone who was nearby at the moment it was received. Callum also told me that he had gotten a new job in a completely different industry, in no way connected with the former activities of his mother's foundation, and that at first, colleagues who learned through the media about his involvement in a high-profile trial treated him with understandable wariness. However, gradually, as he demonstrated a conscientious and responsible attitude to the work entrusted to him, this wariness was replaced by, albeit restrained, respect. He admitted that for the first time in many years he felt something akin to genuine pride in his own, rather than maternal, achievements, even if they were much more modest in scale than his former position in a family structure, possessing significant, albeit illegally acquired, resources. I listened to this story with the professional attention of a person accustomed to evaluating facts and not emotional assurances. And I must admit that what I heard really looked like a sincere movement towards personal maturity, backed by concrete actions. Although this confession, of course, could in no way change my own, long-made decision not to restore relationships once destroyed in such a cruel and unambiguous way. Restoring justice for those who suffered from the Foundation's activities turned out to be a much longer process than the trial of the scheme's organizers itself. The assets confiscated by court order were subject to return to the victimized organizations only after the completion of all appellate procedures initiated by Cordelia's defense and the other suspects. It stretched out over several more months of painstaking work by state executors in conjunction with my new department, to which the holding company's leadership entrusted the supervision of this process as a kind of pilot project, demonstrating the effectiveness of interaction between private business and government structures in matters of recovering stolen funds. It was within the framework of this work that I happened to meet again with the director of the organization helping large families, whose testimony at the time became one of the first weighty pieces of evidence in the case. This time, the meeting took place in a much more joyful atmosphere. She reported that thanks to the funds returned by the court's decision, the organization was finally able to launch the program for which it was originally created, providing real help to several dozen families who had waited for years for support promised, but never received in previous years. The elderly woman, whose savings were directed to the failed construction of a shelter for lonely seniors, also received partial compensation from the returned assets. Although, of course, no monetary sum could fully make up for those years she spent waiting for the promised construction, watching the hope for a quiet old age among like-minded people gradually turn into bitter disappointment. Bumping into me by chance at one of the final meetings of the Commission on the distribution of returned funds, she thanked me briefly but sincerely, saying that now, at least, she knows. Such schemes do not go unpunished if there is at least one person ready to see the exposure through to the very end, regardless of personal circumstances and family ties with the organizers of the deception. Meanwhile, my professional life developed in a direction diametrically opposite to the crisis I had to go through in the personal sphere. The conglomerate's leadership, duly appreciating my role in uncovering one of the largest schemes of charitable fraud in recent years, offered me to head a newly created division specializing precisely in such complex, covert investigations of affiliated structures. It was an offer I accepted without long deliberation. Because exactly this work, combining analytical precision with the real possibility of restoring justice, turned out to be for me not just a source of income, but a true calling, much deeper than I could have imagined at the beginning of my career. The ceremony of stepping into the new position passed modestly, without the excessive publicity I never particularly cared for. However, the CEO, introducing me to the staff of the new department, said words that, I admit, I remembered for a long time. He said that he rarely met specialists capable of combining flawless professional discipline with the personal courage necessary to see through an investigation affecting their own family, and that precisely such a combination of qualities would become the gold standard for everyone who came to work in the new division after me. Colleagues who watched with what dignity I went through a personal crisis, not allowing it to negatively affect the quality of my professional work, treated me with sincere respect. And several young analysts who joined the company after the conclusion of the high-profile case even perceived my story as a kind of professional benchmark, proving that methodology and cold blood can defeat even the most carefully constructed scheme of deception. Among these young specialists, one young woman particularly stood out, a recent finance graduate who once asked for a personal consultation after encountering a situation in her own family remotely resembling mine. Her stepfather, as it turned out from her cautious, anxiety-filled story, conducted business using documents that aroused serious suspicions of their legality in her, and she didn't know what to do, torn between professional duty and fear of destroying already difficult relationships in the family. I told her then not so much my own story in all its dramatic details as a practical algorithm of actions developed over the months of my own investigation. Document facts consistently and without rushing. Seek advice from professionals specializing precisely in such situations, and under no circumstances try to independently issue a final verdict on the guilt or innocence of a loved one, entrusting this function exclusively to competent authorities possessing the necessary powers and tools for this. A few months later, this young woman returned to me with gratitude, reporting that her cautious but consistent actions helped prevent much more serious financial consequences for relatives who had become unwitting participants in a dubious deal. It was a story that delivered me the sincere professional joy of a person seeing that a lesson accumulated through hard experience is capable of bringing benefit not only to herself but to others. One day, Driving on business through the neighborhood where the office of Cordelia's foundation had previously been located, I discovered that the building, which for years had served as a facade for a criminal scheme, was now occupied by a completely different organization. It was a small social support center, created, as I learned later, precisely with the funds returned to the victims by the court's decision. I didn't go inside, limiting myself to a short glance from the opposite side of the street, not out of a desire to avoid unpleasant memories, but rather from a calm realization that my own role in this story had ended much earlier, at the trial stage. The further creative part of the work truly belonged to other people, whose task it was to fill this space with new, much more honest content. Kerrigan, who continued to lead related lines of investigations in her division, once noted in a conversation over a cup of coffee that my case, despite all its personal drama, entered the number of illustrative examples that are now used in training young FBI agents and state prosecutors specializing in economic crimes. It served as an illustration of how properly built cooperation between corporate internal audit and law enforcement agencies is capable of seeing through an investigation that initially seemed practically unsolvable due to the deep conspiracy of the scheme inside a single family. I received this news with restrained pride, understanding that the path I had traveled turned out to be significant not only for me personally, but for dozens of people whose fates were touched by the consequences of the exposed scheme. This included that very director of the small charitable organization with whom I became acquainted at the height of the trial, and whose organization subsequently, thanks to the funds returned by court order, was finally able to implement those programs of assistance to large families for which it was originally created. In parallel with this restorative work, my own reflection on the path traveled continued. Kerrigan, who over the past months had become much more than just a professional contact, but a truly close friend, who shared with me the most intense moments of the whole investigation, once noted during another meeting that she rarely saw people capable of so consistently turning a personal tragedy into a source of professional and human growth, instead of allowing the trauma experience to determine their whole future life exclusively through the prism of the inflicted offense. I answered her then that such a transformation did not come easily or immediately, but was the result of a very conscious choice made back on that very evening when I was lying on the floor of someone else's living room, listening to a demand to cause me pain. Then I decided for myself once and for all that I would allow what happened to become the beginning of a new stage in my own life, and not a stigma determining its further content. My parents, who watched this whole story from its very beginning to its final resolution, treated what happened with the same calm, balanced support that had accompanied me throughout my life. My father once, after the announcement of the final verdict, noted at a family dinner that he was proud not so much of the result as of the way I had arrived at this result. Without hysterics, without public scandals, without attempts to present myself as a victim of circumstances, but exclusively through methodical, consistent work based on facts and professional competence. It was exactly that set of qualities that he and my mother tried to instill in me in childhood, not even suspecting how serious the test would be where these qualities would one day come in handy in full measure. My mother, in turn, added to this conversation her own observation, which seemed to me then particularly accurate. She said that many women, encountering such betrayal from the closest people, tend to spend years endlessly chewing over what happened, looking for newer and newer confirmations of their own rightness, instead of simply acting, whereas I, from the very beginning, chose a path requiring significantly more internal discipline. Not to collect endless proofs of an obvious betrayal of the value system into which they tried to draw me, but to immediately turn each new observation into a concrete step, bringing the resolution closer. As for my personal life after the divorce, here I consciously preferred not to rush into new serious relationships, devoting the freed-up time to professional development, restoring relations with my parents, whom former family obligations forced me to see significantly less often than I would like, as well as a long-standing hobby, for which there was previously catastrophically not enough time, the long-term study of a foreign language. I started doing this not as a consoling cliché after a divorce, but exclusively because a real practical interest in the international practice of combating financial crimes required fluency in professional terminology, significantly expanding the range of sources available to me in my work. Separate mention goes to how my perception of my own former trust in people changed. I found in myself not suspiciousness that corrodes any new acquaintances, but rather a heightened professional attentiveness to discrepancies between words and deeds, a quality that I now consciously applied not only at work, but in everyday communication, trying to notice such alarming signals significantly earlier than I allowed myself to notice them in relationships with Callum and his mother. This change, however, never turned into total distrust of the entire surrounding world. Rather, into the healthy, balanced caution of a person who once paid a high price for her own excessive gullibility and does not intend to repeat such a mistake in the future. The freedom gained after the end of this prolonged, exhausting confrontation turned out to be, for me, a self-sufficient value, not needing mandatory filling with a new romantic story. The feeling of full, unconditional disposal of my own life, my time, and my decisions, of which I found myself deprived throughout the years of marriage, became in itself the reward for which it was worth going through everything experienced. I repainted the walls in the townhouse I inherited from my grandmother, not at all with the aim of erasing memories of the years of marriage lived here, but rather from a sincere desire to finally create a space that fully reflects my own tastes and not the compromises I went along with for years for the sake of preserving the appearance of family harmony. A space free from someone else's presence and someone else's demands, where every interior detail belonged exclusively to my own choice. Unexpected for me was a call from Callum's younger sister, with whom I previously almost didn't communicate, since she lived in another state and appeared in my husband's family's life, significantly less often than true family relations would allow. She called shortly after the announcement of the verdict to apologize, as she explained it herself, for the fact that for many years she preferred to stay away from her mother's affairs, intuitively feeling something dysfunctional in them, but not finding in herself enough resolve to intervene, or at least warn me about her own vague suspicions. I answered her then without the slightest reproach, noting that I understand how difficult it is for a person raised under the influence of such a domineering mother to find the strength for open confrontation. I told her that much more important than the time spent in silence is that she found the courage to admit this years later. It was an answer that, judging by her voice, brought her noticeable relief. And from this conversation, much warmer and much more honest relationships gradually began to form between us than existed throughout the entire period of my marriage to her brother. About 2 years after the divorce, at an industry conference dedicated to combating economic crimes, I was asked to present a report on my own professional experience in uncovering a scheme that by that time had become a widely known precedent in narrow professional circles. Giving this presentation was significantly easier for me than I had anticipated, because talking about what happened in the language of professional facts, devoid of personal dramatization, turned out to be the most natural way for me to process my own experience. After the report, several colleagues from other states approached me, having encountered similar family schemes within their own client organizations, and one of them, an elderly auditor with many years of experience, noted that my story convincingly proves that family ties with a potential violator should not become a reason for a specialist to recuse themselves, but, on the contrary, can become a unique advantage for a conscientious and principled professional ready to put objectivity above personal comfort. It was exactly after this conference that a specialized publication approached me with a request to give an extensive interview about my own experience. It was a proposal I initially treated with a fair amount of caution, not wanting to turn an experienced personal drama into a subject of public curiosity. However, having thought it over more carefully, I decided to agree on one indispensable condition. The interview had to focus exclusively on the professional aspects of the investigation, the methodology of collecting evidence, and practical recommendations for specialists who found themselves in a similar situation, and not at all on the emotional details of the violence that occurred. The journalist preparing the material treated this condition with full understanding, and the final publication, which came out a few weeks later, really turned out to be sustained exactly in that business-like tone, devoid of excessive sensationalism, that I had asked for. This subsequently brought me a lot of grateful feedback from colleagues. Over time, I discovered that the experience changed not only my professional approach, but the very manner of building relationships with people in general. I became significantly more demanding of my own surroundings. I notice much faster the alarming signals of discrepancy between a person's declared values and their real actions, and I much more decisively stop communicating with those who demonstrate even a remote resemblance to the behavioral model that once ruined my first marriage. Friends who knew me even before marriage noted that I became harsher in my judgments, However, I myself preferred to call this quality, not harshness, but an finally acquired ability, not to waste precious time on people and circumstances undeserving of such investments. An ability that I clearly lacked in those years, when I preferred to believe beautiful words instead of carefully observing real actions. It is worth mentioning how the further fate of Cordelia herself turned out after the verdict entered into legal force. An appeal filed by her new, less famous lawyer, replacing the former one who refused to take the case after such a high-profile loss, was rejected by a higher appellate court without any significant review of the assigned punishment. And a separate petition to mitigate the conditions of her confinement due to health reasons the court also considered insufficiently justified, taking into account the conclusion of an independent medical examination that did not confirm the stated severity of the existing illnesses. Kerrigan, tracking the course of the appellate proceedings out of duty, informed me that such an outcome was quite predictable, given the exhaustive completeness of the evidentiary base collected at the pre-trial stage. It was a circumstance once again confirming the correctness of the strategy I chose at the very beginning, to act methodically and patiently at the stage of collecting facts, so as not to leave the defense the slightest room for procedural maneuvers later. The fate of the Foundation's former CPA, who for years had compiled fictitious reporting on Cordelia's direct orders, developed in a curious way. This man, whose name appeared in the case as one of the secondary suspects, unexpectedly to many, insisted on a full admission of his own guilt, even at the pre-trial stage. He refused the services of the lawyer offered to him by his former patrons and stated to the prosecution that he was tired of living for years with the weight of his own complicity in a scheme that ruined the lives of so many people who trusted the Foundation. His sincere repentance, backed by exhaustive testimony, significantly facilitated the prosecution's work and allowed the judge to assign him a significantly lighter sentence than the rest of the key participants in the scheme. It was a case that Kerrigan subsequently cited more than once as an example to young agents, as an illustration that even among accomplices in major crimes, there are sometimes people who have retained the capacity for a genuine moral awakening. As for my own emotional state during this period, it would be incorrect to state that this whole long story ended for me exclusively in triumph without the slightest admixture of bitterness. To this day, remembering that evening in my mother-in-law's living room, I feel an echo of the shock I experienced, although significantly less acute than in the first months after what happened. And this feeling, as a therapist, I turned to on my own initiative shortly after the completion of the main trial once explained to me, is a completely natural reaction to experience trauma, regardless of how successfully the subsequent proceedings ended. Several sessions with this specialist helped me finally separate in my own mind the professional pride in the investigation brought to completion and the personal, much more complex work of processing betrayal from a person I once genuinely loved. It is work that, as the therapist honestly warned me, has no clear final boundary, but gradually, step by step, becomes a less heavy burden as ordinary life, filled with new meanings, takes over the memory of what was experienced. It is worth mentioning the broader public resonance that the case received after the final sentences were handed down. Regional media covering the trial for several months devoted separate exposés, analyzing how nonprofit organizations, in principle, can become a convenient tool for money laundering and financing political ambitions, bypassing legal limits. And several legislators in the state assembly, taking advantage of the public outcry, initiated the drafting of amendments tightening requirements for the transparency of NGO reporting and introducing mandatory independent audits for 501c3 funds working with large corporate donations. Kerrigan, who followed this legislative initiative out of duty, once remarked in conversation that such systemic changes, even if launched with some delay, represent an almost more significant result of all the work done than the personal punishment of specific culprits, since they are capable of preventing the emergence of similar schemes in the future, protecting unknown beneficiaries and donors from a similar fate. Looking back now on the path traveled, I often ask myself a question that surely also interests those reading this story. Do I regret the decision to marry a man whose family subsequently turned out to be a source of so many shocks? And every time I come to the same conclusion, devoid of any sentimentality. Regret in such cases seems to me a pointless waste of energy, since no person is capable of foreseeing in advance the true nature of those with whom they link their fate. And the only thing that really matters is exactly how you act when faced with the revealed truth. I could have pretended for years that I didn't notice anything. I could have sought compromises where no compromise could be. I could have endured humiliation for the sake of preserving the appearance of a prosperous family. But instead, I chose a path requiring significantly more courage and significantly more patience of a professional rather than submissive nature. Methodically, step by step, collecting not excuses for my own inaction, but irrefutable grounds for decisive actions, bringing the matter to an end regardless of the personal price that had to be paid for it. It is precisely this lesson, drawn from the whole series of experienced events, that I consider the main result of my own story, much more important than the very fact of a court verdict or professional recognition. A person's dignity is determined not by the absence of difficulties on their path, but by their ability not to put up with injustice directed against them. No matter how close the people causing this injustice seem, and no matter how convincing their attempts to justify their own cruelty with concern for family or money look, I did not spend years collecting evidence of someone else's betrayal, postponing decisive actions to an indefinite future in the hope that everything would somehow work itself out. From the very beginning, I acted based on professional knowledge and cold calculation, turning each new confirmation of my own rightness not into a reason for further patience, but into the next step towards an inevitable, carefully prepared climax. And if you, reading this story right now, ever find yourself faced with the need to choose between a comfortable silence and an uncomfortable truth, between preserving the appearance of well-being and genuine dignity, I sincerely hope that my own experience will become for you not a reason for fear, but a reminder that determination, backed by facts and cold-blooded calculation, is always stronger than any, even the most authoritative and most sophisticated deception.